I first saw Ethan Caldwell on a gray Monday morning, walking through the glass doors of Harrington Therapeutics as if the building had been waiting all its life for him to arrive. And from the moment he stepped inside, I knew that difference was going to cost someone dearly. I just never imagined that someone would be me. If you're curious about how a forgotten patent turned his arrogance into a disaster, please like this video. Where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Oh, by the way, let me tell you more about that man. He had that polished kind of confidence that comes from never having to prove much before being trusted with everything. Expensive navy suit, perfect haircut, phone in one hand, coffee in the other, barely looking at the people who stepped aside to let him pass. He was not a scientist. He was not a pharmacist. He had never stood inside a sterile production room at midnight, trying to save a batch that hundreds of patients were depending on. But he was married to the CEO's daughter, and apparently, that was enough. His name was Ethan Caldwell, and within 8 months of marrying into the Harrington family, he had been given the title of Chief Operations Officer. No company-wide search, no interview process anyone could explain. 1 week, our former operations director was quietly packing up her office. The next, Ethan's name was on the door. My name is Wendy Moore. I was 29 when I joined Harrington Therapeutics as a junior formulation chemist. By the time Ethan arrived, I had spent 19 years inside that company, 19 years of early mornings, failed trials, emergency calls, regulatory audits, late-night corrections, and training people who later became department heads. I had stayed when the company nearly collapsed. I had stayed when inspectors threatened our license. I had stayed when everyone else started polishing their resumes. Not because Harrington was perfect, because the work mattered. We made custom medications for people who had run out of ordinary options, children who needed precise doses, elderly patients who could not tolerate standard formulas, families who trusted us because one small mistake could change everything. Ethan looked at Harrington and saw only numbers, targets, and profit. I looked at the same company and saw the patients who depended on every formula we made. That was the difference between us, and sooner or later, I knew that difference would become dangerous. You know, this story is fictional and enhanced with the help of AI to make it more vivid, but the emotions, lessons, and meaning it carries can still feel very real. Let's continue. Ethan's first all-staff meeting happened 3 weeks after his name appeared on the office door. He stood at the front of the main conference room beneath the Harrington Therapeutics logo, smiling like a man about to announce a victory no one else had agreed to fight for. Around him sat pharmacists, chemists, technicians, compliance officers, and quality staff, people who understood that in our line of work, confidence was useful only when it was backed by competence. Ethan opened his laptop, clicked to the first slide, and told us the company had been thinking too small for too long. He said Harrington had a tremendous opportunity to expand market share. He talked about accelerating output, maximizing client pipelines, improving margins, and creating a more aggressive growth culture. He said the word scale so many times that I wrote it in the corner of my notebook just to keep count. What he did not say was patience, not once. He did not mention the children whose dosages had to be calculated down to the smallest tolerance. He did not mention the elderly patients whose bodies rejected standard formulations. He did not mention sterile technique, contamination control, clinical accuracy, or the audit trail that protected every single person who depended on us. To Ethan, our work was a machine that needed to run faster. To the rest of us, it was a system that had to run correctly. Then he announced his first major target. Harrington would increase production volume by 38% within 2 quarters. The room went still. A few people glanced at me. Others looked down at the printed slides in front of them, as if the numbers might become more reasonable if we stared at them long enough. Martin Bell, one of our senior compounding supervisors, raised his hand and asked whether the clean room schedule, staffing limits, and quality review windows had been recalculated. Ethan smiled at him. Martin, That's exactly the kind of cautious thinking we need to move beyond. And that was when I understood. He wasn't here to learn the business. He was here to force it to obey him by the following month. Ethan's targets stopped being slides and started becoming instructions. Production calendars were rewritten, batch windows were compressed, weekend shifts appeared without discussion. The language around the lab changed almost overnight. What used to be called verification became delay. What used to be called caution became resistance. What used to be called patient safety became, in Ethan's words, operational drag. I submitted my first written concern in May. It was 3 pages long and painfully specific. I listed clean room capacity, technician fatigue, documentation bottlenecks, stability review timing, and the risk of pushing complex formulations through a schedule designed for simple repeat orders. I sent it to Ethan, quality assurance, and the technical director. Ethan replied 12 hours later, noted, let's stay solution-focused. That was all. In June, I sent a second memo after one of our technicians caught a labeling discrepancy during final review. It was corrected before anything left the building. But that was exactly the point. The final review had worked. The safeguard had caught the mistake before it reached a patient. Ethan called it proof that the system was too slow. By July, he had changed the reporting structure so quality assurance no longer answered independently to the technical team. Findings now went through operations first, which meant, through him, it was presented as streamlining. Everyone who understood compliance knew what it really was. Then came the decision that made my stomach go cold. Ethan removed the mandatory pre-batch verification step for high-risk custom formulations. That procedure had been created years earlier by Dr. Elaine Mercer, our former chief formulation officer, after a near-catastrophic error that everyone at Harrington still remembered. I had helped her rebuild the system afterward. We had tested it, revised it, argued over it, and strengthened it until it became the backbone of our safety process. Ethan dismissed it in one meeting. Legacy paperwork, he said, across the table. Martin Bell stared at me without speaking. I knew exactly what he was thinking. Some mistakes do not announce themselves when they begin. They wait quietly inside a system until someone vulnerable pays the price. In September, I was called to Ethan's office at 9:14 in the morning. I remember the time because I had just finished reviewing a stability report and was walking back toward the lab with my coat folded over one arm. His assistant stopped me near the corridor and said Ethan needed to see me immediately. Her voice was careful in the way people sound when they know something uncomfortable before you do. His office had once belonged to Margaret Ellis, the former operations director, who had understood every corner of the company better than most executives understood their own job titles. Margaret had kept framed photos of her grandchildren on the shelf and a handwritten note from a patient's mother beside her computer. Ethan had replaced all of that with a glass award he had not earned and a black and white print that said, "Growth favors the bold." He did not ask me to sit down. "Wendy," he said, folding his hands on the desk. "I want to be direct. This is part of a broader operational realignment." There it was. The language companies use when they want cruelty to sound strategic. He told me my role as principal formulation chemist was being eliminated. He said Harrington needed to become leaner, faster, and less dependent on outdated internal structures. He said my responsibilities would be redistributed among remaining staff and overseen by the new operations model. I looked at him for a moment, waiting for some sign that he understood what he had just said. There was none. He slid an envelope across the desk. Final pay. Transition instructions. HR contact details. A clean little package for 19 years of work. I picked up the envelope but did not open it. "Ethan," I said quietly, "have you reviewed the intellectual property provisions in my original employment agreement?" His expression barely changed. "HR has handled the paperwork." "I'm not talking about HR paperwork. I'm talking about the patent records connected to my work before Harrington." He gave me a thin, patient smile. "Wendy, I think we're done here." So I stood up, held the envelope in my hand, and said, "All right, Have a good morning. If you believe Ethan Caldwell was right to fire me after 19 years of dedication, comment, he was right. But if you believe what he did was arrogant and unfair, then comment she deserved better. I want to know which side you're on, because this moment changes everything. I walked back to my desk slowly, not because I wanted anyone to stop me, but because I needed to look at the place one last time without anger clouding my vision. The corridor smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, the same strange combination that had followed me through almost 2 decades of mornings. Behind the glass walls, technicians moved between stations, heads lowered, gloved hands steady. Printers clicked, monitors blinked. Somewhere in the clean room, a timer chimed softly. Life inside Harrington Therapeutics continued as if nothing had happened. That was the part that almost broke me. I took a cardboard box from the supply room and began placing my things inside. A framed photo of my sister and me at Lake Michigan, a ceramic mug that said, "Trust the data," a small jade plant Martin had given me after my 15th year at the company, 3 notebooks that were mine and not Harrington's. I checked twice before putting them in my bag. Martin Bell appeared beside my desk before I heard him approach. "Wendy," he said, and then stopped. There are moments when words are too small for the damage being done. He understood that. So did I. He hugged me carefully, like I might shatter if he held too tightly. I almost did, but I had spent too many years in rooms where people confused emotion with weakness, and I refused to let Ethan Caldwell's last image of me be a woman falling apart. A few others came by. Some whispered that they were sorry. Some looked frightened. Some looked away because fear makes decent people quiet. I did not blame them. At 10:48 a.m., I walked out through the same glass doors Ethan had entered that morning, carrying one box, one coat, and 19 years of knowledge no one had thought to measure. By the time the parking lot disappeared in my rearview mirror, I understood one thing clearly. Ethan had not just fired me. He had fired the person who knew exactly where Harrington's foundation was buried. What Ethan did not know, what almost no one in the executive suite seemed to remember, was that Harrington's most valuable process had existed before Harrington ever paid me a salary. In 2004, I was 28 years old and finishing a research fellowship in pharmaceutical science at the University of Wisconsin. My work focused on stability behavior in complex, compounded medications, especially formulas that combined active ingredients that could become unstable under the wrong conditions. It was not glamorous research. No one clapped for clean data at midnight, but I loved it because it solved a real problem. Small compounding operations often struggled with consistency when medications were customized for patients with unusual needs. A dose might be correct on paper and still behave unpredictably if the interaction model was incomplete. I became obsessed with that gap. For more than a year, I built and refined a verification methodology that could test stability, ingredient interaction, and batch consistency before a high-risk formula moved forward. My mentor, Dr. Rachel Whitmore, told me the work was too important to leave in a notebook, so I filed the patent, not under Wendy Moore, back then, before my marriage and later divorce. My legal name was Wendy Carver. The patent was granted under that name. It covered a specific class of stability testing and interaction modeling protocols for custom pharmaceutical compounding. When I joined Harrington Therapeutics, I was using the name Moore for the first few years. No one connected the patent to me. Then, in 2010, our former CEO, Richard Harrington, found the methodology during a regulatory review and realized it matched the process I had quietly adapted inside our lab. He did what a competent leader does. He asked questions. We signed a licensing agreement. Harrington could use my methodology legally inside its compounding operations, and I would remain the registered owner of the intellectual property. The agreement was renewed several times over the years. By the time Ethan fired me, that methodology was not a side tool. It was inside Harrington's safety reports, batch reviews, compliance records, and the production system supporting their $94 million operation, and the license was about to expire. The license had always been scheduled to expire at the end of that year. That detail sat in my personal files at home, inside a blue folder I had not opened in months after I left Harrington. I made tea, changed out of the blouse I had worn to work, and sat at my kitchen table staring at that folder for a long time. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired. 19 years is a long time to give a place. Long enough for the building to become part of your daily rhythm. Long enough to know which stairwell was quietest, which freezer alarm was too sensitive, which technicians hummed when they were nervous. Long enough to believe, foolishly maybe, that the people in charge would understand what they had before they threw it away. That afternoon, I called my attorney, Julian Price. Julian had helped me with the original patent filing back when I was still Wendy Carver. He remembered the methodology immediately. When I explained what had happened, he went silent for several seconds. Then he said, "Wendy, they terminated the patent holder 4 months before renewal." Yes. Did they realize that I don't think Ethan realizes much beyond his own reflection? Julian did not laugh. That told me everything. We reviewed the agreement line by line. Harrington had the right to use my methodology only through the current license period. Renewal required mutual consent. Continued use after expiration without a new agreement would expose them to infringement claims and compliance complications they could not afford. I did not call Ethan. I did not call CEO Charles Harrington. I did not send an emotional message to anyone. In late November, Julian delivered formal notice to Harrington Therapeutics' legal department. The license for the Carver stability verification method would expire on December 31st, and under current circumstances, I did not intend to renew it. Attached were the patent records, the original licensing agreement, and every renewal document, for the first time since 9/14 that morning. Harrington had to read my name carefully. The response did not come from Ethan. That told me more than any apology could have. 3 days after the notice was delivered, Julian called to say Harrington's legal department had requested an urgent meeting. Their tone, he said, had changed between the first email and the second. The first was formal. The second was careful. The third sounded like someone had finally opened the right drawer. I later heard pieces of what happened inside the company from Martin. Legal pulled the records. Compliance pulled the audit files. Quality assurance pulled the batch verification manuals. Then, one by one, they realized the Carver stability verification method was not sitting politely in one department where it could be removed and replaced. It was everywhere. It was in the high-risk formulation reviews. It was in the stability reports submitted during inspections. It was in the training documents for new chemists. It was referenced in internal safety procedures, production approvals, and client assurance files. Over 19 years. The method had become part of the way Harrington proved its medications were consistent, safe, and defensible. Replacing it was not like changing software. It meant rebuilding the logic behind their entire quality process. Martin told me the new technical consultant they had brought in from Boston looked pale after the first briefing. At one point, someone asked how long it would take to create a legally clean alternative. The answer was not comforting. Months, possibly longer, and only if production slowed down. For a company that had just promised aggressive growth, that was a disaster. For a company making patient-specific medication, rushing the replacement would be worse than a disaster. It would be dangerous. I was told Ethan sat through the legal briefing without saying much. Finally, he asked, "Who exactly is Wendy Carver?" No one answered right away, because by then, everyone in the room understood. Wendy Carver was Wendy Moore, and Wendy Moore was the woman he had fired. The first meeting happened in January. In a conference room I had walked past hundreds of times without ever imagining I would sit there as the person across the table. Julian sat beside me with a folder thick enough to make Harrington's legal team avoid eye contact. Across from us were 2 attorneys, the new technical director, and Charles Harrington himself. Ethan was not there. No one explained his absence. And I did not ask. Charles looked older than I remembered. Not weak, not defeated, but aware in the way people become aware when a mistake has finally reached their desk with numbers attached to it. He began by saying, "Wendy, I'm sorry for how this was handled." I nodded once. An apology mattered, but it did not replace what had been ignored. Julian opened the discussion with the patent scope, the expired license terms, and Harrington's dependence on the Carver stability verification method. The company wanted continued access. I was willing to discuss it, but not under the old arrangement, and not while the safety systems Ethan had dismantled remained broken. The new agreement had 3 conditions. First, the licensing fee would reflect the true commercial value of the method, not the symbolic amount agreed to years earlier when Harrington was struggling. Second, my authorship would be formally acknowledged in internal documentation, compliance references, and technical training materials. Third, the high-risk pre-batch verification procedure created by Dr. Elaine Mercer and refined by me would be reinstated as a mandatory non-negotiable operating standard. The new technical director agreed before the lawyers finished taking notes. Charles did not argue either. He only asked, quietly, whether this would allow Harrington to keep serving patients without interruption. "That," I said, "is the only reason I'm sitting here." We signed the revised agreement 2 weeks later, by February. Ethan Caldwell was gone. In March, I was invited to speak at the Midwest Compounding Safety Forum in Chicago. The topic was supposed to be stability verification in small and mid-sized pharmaceutical operations. But everyone in that room understood there was another subject underneath it: documentation, ownership, institutional memory, the cost of assuming that quiet people are replaceable. I stood at the podium and talked about the Carver stability verification method, not as a weapon, but as proof that careful work deserves a name. I talked about patient safety, about why protocols exist, and about what happens when companies remove safeguards without understanding the pain that created them. Afterward, a young chemist came up to me and asked how I stayed calm after being dismissed so easily. I told her the truth, because the work was always bigger than the insult. Over the next year, the patent was licensed to 6 compounding facilities across the United States and Canada. I began consulting directly with 3 of them. I also started developing a second methodology with a research team at the University of Wisconsin. This time, no one had to search an old file to know whose name was on it. My name is Wendy Carver Moore. I am 48 years old. I built something valuable before powerful people knew how to value me, and in the end, that made all the difference. There are moments in life when being underestimated becomes the quietest kind of power. This story reminded me that my value does not disappear just because someone fails to recognize it. I learned 5 lessons. First, I must document the work I create, because memory can be ignored, but records speak clearly. Second, I should never confuse silence with weakness. Sometimes calm is the strongest answer. Third, loyalty is meaningful, but it should never make me forget my own worth. Fourth, true leadership protects people and purpose, not just profit. Fifth, when I build something valuable, I must make sure my name stays attached to it. What about you? Did this story leave you with a lesson of your own? Share it in the comments, because your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story touched you, please subscribe, like, and share it, not just to support this channel, but to help remind someone out there that their quiet work, their loyalty, and their names still matter.
Welcome to Boardroom Revenge Stories, a channel focused on workplace conflict, corporate betrayal, power struggles, and quiet justice. Our stories follow a structured workflow to deliver a consistent, immersive experience. We start by analyzing real discussions on Reddit, Facebook, Quora, and blogs. Next, we craft original scripts using AI tools like ChatGPT. We then use 11 Labs to transform text into high-quality voice and edit everything in CapCut for a smooth, cinematic finish. Thumbnails are designed with Canva, and every video is carefully reviewed before release. These stories go beyond entertainment, revealing how power truly works and how justice quietly unfolds.